Archaeologists of Reddit, what are some latest discoveries that the masses have no idea of? In my hometown of Lübeck in northern Germany, they found a latrine from the Middle Age and analyzed the genes of the tapeworms in it, or something, and apparently that dude that took a shit there has once also taken a shit in England, cause his DNA has been found in tapeworms there as well. Lübeck was a major port city and trading center in medieval times, and had lots of people coming in and out of it from all over. Bristol was also a major port city and trading center. So, it's not too big of a surprise that people could have visited both places, probably a trader or sailor. Also, it's not so much that they found the same guy's DNA in both places as much as it is that they found parasites that originated in Lübeck and Bristol and vice versa. It was the parasite's DNA that they were looking at. It doesn't mean that the same exact fecal samples came from the same dude. Op wasn't entirely correct. I am primarily an Egyptologist, but I work for a UK regional archaeology crew, and recently they found a specific vessel which was very unusual. It's hard to describe, but I couldn't find a picture, but it was a smallish clay pot, which had been made on a wheel, and was incredibly well made, but the neck of it was tiny, and it pinched in and out at points. Bad description, I know. Anyway, we got it dated to around the Stuart era, and gave it over to a potter who we sometimes worked with, so he could attempt to make a copy. He couldn't do it. He made a lovely pot, but it was nothing like the original. He explained that he couldn't get the clay thin enough to pinch like the original, because his hands were simply too big to make a pot with a neck of that size. So, after a lot of thought, they came to a conclusion that it must have been children making these pots. I suggested women, but it turned out even women's hands were too big. Based on other circumstantial evidence from the same context, this was from a relatively poor family who trained their children in the same trade as them to create beautiful pottery to sell to the elites. In the Stuart era, that style of pottery was around a lot, but it had started not too far from the city we found it in, so we figured they must have been copying the popular style. It's so interesting to think that a child, probably no more than 8, made such a beautiful piece of work. I have only just got my degree, so I can't really give an expert opinion, but it is interesting. A friend of mine recently did a paper on the Great Sphinx, so I might have to ask her. My main research focus is on Ptolemaic Roman funerary contexts and cultural transfer, although I do love the Pharaonic period. TPH, I don't know much about the Sphinx as a result. The pyramids themselves date to the Old Kingdom, that's for definite, as they were made for Khufu and his ancestors. Interesting fact, the Great Pyramid is actually the smallest of the 3, but he built it on a hill to make it look bigger. Also, when it comes to the rocks, cutting them was a slow and laborious process, but the way they were moved into place is a relatively recent discovery. Basically, they built huge ramps, with posts dug in them on either side at intervals, then looped ropes around them, and around the stones, and dragged the stone up the ramp. The post holes were discovered by a set of Egyptologists, friends of mine, who were looking at texts, but happened to stumble across the remains of one of the ramps. The cutting of the rocks is something I have heard about, but can't remember off the top of my head though. I watched a documentary a few weeks ago which went into detail about it, but I can't remember for the life of me what it was. The Great Pyramid, or the Pyramid of Khufu, is actually the largest pyramid of the complex. The second largest is the Pyramid of Khafre, Khufu's son. This is the middle pyramid, and since it sits on bedrock 10 meters higher than the Great Pyramid, it appears to be the tallest of the 3. However, Khufu's pyramid is the oldest and tallest of the 3. I loved reading about the discovery of the ramp when it happened last year, so fascinating. Recently, a ton of phenomenal finds have been excavated in Britain. Examples being a preserved Iron Age shield found in Leicestershire, which changes how we perceived Iron Age British tribal equipment in combat, hoping it will open the door to a broader understanding of the military capabilities of this period, and that C14 dating will give us a more specific dating assessment. I have mainly worked in classical Greek and Imperial Roman archaeology, and Vindolanta is one such site which has been pumping out phenomenal research and artifact findings. Being a reasonably well-preserved Roman fort along Hadrian's Wall, artifacts are found daily. During the past couple of weeks, finds have ranged from leather shoes, tent canvas, even bathhouse sandals to prevent you burning your feet on the hot tiles. These finds have opened a window of immense understanding of daily life within a Roman defensive fort. I would most definitely, as it is always a pleasure to have people show an interest and an appreciation for our shared and fascinating history. It's a wonderful opportunity to see firsthand as to why these artifacts need to be preserved and cared for in a manner that we can learn from. If you do decide to volunteer, be prepared for a lot of trench work in the rain, and a lot of watching and learning from archaeologists on site, as site excavations are as delicate as a crime scene, as you try to piece together the mystery of the finds. If you have any linguistic background, or are great at decoding or solving mysteries, that always helps as well. There's always a need for a cross-disciplinary approach towards excavations of fort complexes, from climatologists to architects to historians, so any skill to add to the list needed on site is always appreciated. When I say an archaeological site is like a crime scene, I very much mean it. It's not simply a throwaway analogy to spice up life in the trenches. Each piece, however small, within a site grid is highly important, and is a puzzle piece which allows us to understand the context of its form, function and use. If that piece is removed by a rogue detectorist, its archaeological value is lost, and that one piece of the puzzle is oftentimes impossible to trace back to help with understanding the rest of the site context. The value of artifacts does not come in its worth as most news sites would lead people to believe. Sadly, the BBC is a massive culprit of spreading and promoting this detrimentally damaging behavior by posting news stories of finds amounting in the hundreds of thousands. It saddens me deeply how this is not properly disseminated to the general public in as meaningful and easily digestible manner when discussing site worker finds. It is one of the most pressing concerns in the field and has far darker implications when you continue to follow the rabbit hole. In Ireland, there is great reason that there is a heavy criminal punishment for this practice, as our history and its preservation is already teetering on the edge of destruction in terms of our deeper understanding of it, through consecutive attempts at destroying it by our enemies throughout our tumultuous history. This is not an academic ivory tower viewpoint. This is a saddening and frustrating viewpoint of someone who has grown up with a passion and respect for the field. People in the UK and Ireland don't go to university for 3 to 4 years to study archaeology for the Craig, to then sit in a muddy field, to get paid cents, with hardly any union protection, constantly under the thumb of property developers and infrastructure contractors. They do it because they have a burning desire to preserve, document and continue to grow our understanding of the very thing which makes us who we are today. So, to answer your question, yes, sadly these groups do exist, yet hopefully further down the line, the same approach to stamp them out will be undertaken in an EU-wide legislation to preserve our culture and history. I have been to 2 digs that have been raided overnight by detectorists. Everything was dug over, everything was damaged, nothing could be recorded anymore. They literally destroy archaeological sites to the degree archaeologists can't make anything of it. It happens regularly, and they are a thorn in an archaeologist's side. I am an archaeologist who mostly works in the private sector. We find a lot of cool stuff, but almost everything we do is classified to some degree or another to discourage pot hunters and vandalism. This year I found an extension of a really important late woodland, the period right before Europeans arrived in America, site, and worked on a very cool 19th century burial ground that had been partially destroyed out of negligence by a construction company, which is a big problem we run into. Both sites were super cool, but I can't get into specifics about where they're located. The remains of the last slave ship to smuggle imported slaves into America, after it was outlawed, was just found in Alabama. I don't know a lot about it, because I'm not an underwater archaeologist, though. My sister lives in a house in the UK, and it's next door to a church with a history going back almost 1,000 years. It was probably something to do with Druids before Christianity, anyway. She regularly finds ancient-looking human bones in her garden. She just looks away, and pats them back underground, because she's not keen on investigations. A friend of mine dug up the bones of perhaps 30 people about 12 years ago. Turns out his house was built atop of a mass grave used for people that died of dysentery. The police came and had a kick around to make sure it wasn't anything recent, but the bones were hundreds of years old and just surprisingly well preserved. He called me up and said, "Hey, you ever seen a dead body? Wanna see like 50? I did, so I did. It was kind of sad in a historically fascinating way. Most of the bones were from very small people. It's an old city with a lot of history, even the local news didn't care. I guess it happens somewhat often. He ended up covering them back up and doing his digging elsewhere. This one always bugs me as an archaeologist. Not because of the public, but because of our own slow adoption of technology. There have been archaeologists using LiDAR since the early 2000s. It's only becoming popular now because of a few large-scale applications. Its use should be standard in the discipline, but we have pretty much no standards whatsoever. I know other archaeologists will argue, but we don't have the money. We don't have the money because we're too traditionalist and conservative to change some of the most basic things in archaeology. Anyway, it's still really cool stuff. There are some very prominent archaeologists and groups of archaeologists that are entirely against the discipline being a science. They're part of the post-processual movement, and their ideas really stunt the growth of science in archaeology. They take on a lot of postmodern ideas and love what I think are ridiculous things, like using poetry or fiction as excavation methodology. It's actually what my PhD research is on. I don't think archaeology can be considered a science at the moment, but I think we can become a science if we develop basic standards and basic scientific methodologies for the core of archaeology. We use a lot of scientific methods already, like carbon dating, but those are specializations that are adopted that are already scientific. Okay, I have got another one related to my actual degree, Egyptology. The tomb of Neith-Hotep was discovered in the early 1900s, but it was badly damaged, and therefore we're still investigating all the material we have. A lot of it was burned by tomb robbers, but there is still some epigraphic evidence. One of the most interesting pieces is a tiny piece of pottery with a serach on it, the symbol of the name of the king. For context, Neith-Hotep was from pre-dynastic Egypt, just before the First Dynasty. And this is where it gets exciting. Neith-Hotep is believed to be the mother of the first pharaoh of Egypt. However, on this piece of pottery, her name is written in a serach, indicating she was a pharaoh. Of course, it's possible that it was just indicating her as queen, but it's quite fun to think that there's a very good chance the first pharaoh of Egypt was a woman. Furthermore, as far as we can tell, this is the earliest ever surviving evidence of a woman's name written down. We all thought that was pretty cool. I don't know if it's national news or anything, but a bunch of fossils and bones of some sort of horned dino were just found on a construction site in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. My cousin's boyfriend was one of the workers that found them. Some dick on his team was trying to load his truck up with a bunch of the fossils and bones and destroyed them. The museum had to confiscate stuff from him. But it's still pretty cool that Colorado has another dinosaur. I think we've had another dinosaur and another really good set of fossils found here. Also, I know this is paleontology and not archaeology, but it's still cool, and I wasn't thinking about that when I decided to post. It's at the museum I work at right now. It's a mammoth bone that the museum is claiming has human processing marks. They refuse to let other anthropologists look at it to really examine the marks, so I am calling BS, or at least I'm skeptical. I got to look at it very briefly along with some other anthropologists, but then the museum stops everyone. It has everyone pretty split. It was found in San Diego, and if this was to be true, it would rewrite everything about human migration we know. This is not a small museum. This is a public museum, not religiously affiliated, that is making a large claim. A lot of infighting. It's difficult to talk about things that have been found in the field, but not formally published. The act of publishing is where all the background information, theoretical models, data collection, and analysis go to offer interpretations of finds found in the field. Like, you may have found a tomb, but you can't say much more than it is a tomb, the location, and a general overview of the contents without sitting down and doing the analysis of the mortuary goods, the skeletal remains, and the soils, and then comparing all of that to other known excavated tombs to find similarities and differences on a regional, temporal, and/or cultural scale. So as a rule, archaeologists tend not to talk about things they found in the field until they've had a chance to do all that work and get a publication either in the process of being published, review and edit stage, or the publication is scheduled to come out soon in the next issue of a journal. There's a lot more work that goes into archaeology than many people realize. It's not just digging in the dirt, giving what you find a cursory glance, and making broad sweeping proclamations about the past. There's radiocarbon samples, ceramic sherds, charred obsidian, bones, metal, fibers, soil, pollen, faunal remains, floral remains, etc. That can and is tested to inform us about the dates of occupation, where clay or charred obsidian sources are located, the DNA of a person, or the stable isotope value that indicates where they grew up, the sources of metals, what plants or animals make up the preserved fibers, chemical signatures in the soil that may indicate certain kinds of activity, the types of plants being grown nearby, and the animals and plants people consumed. It's a monumental undertaking to do archaeology. That being said, I could talk about some recent work that I've done and presented on at a conference, if anyone is still interested. Don't know how major or interesting this is, but in Athens in the area of Phaler, Acute, which used to be the port of ancient Athens before it was moved to Piraeus, during some excavations for the construction of a cultural center, a huge cemetery was discovered. An entire year of construction was put on hold, and this is a frequent problem in Athens. Major construction work running into ancient buried buildings which now have to be preserved. Apparently, the cemetery is interesting, not only because it hosts many dead babies and children, which were buried inside vessels. Infant mortality rate was very high, but also many prisoners and criminals who were executed. There's also a mass grave of about 80 shackled men. It has been speculated the mass grave may be related to Solon of Athens, a winner in the Olympics and one-up tyrant, who tried to stage a coup by taking over the Acropolis, but was promptly chased out of there by miracles of a powerful Athenian clan, and escaped to Megara. His followers sought refuge in the altar of Athena Polios. Anyone present at an altar was considered to be under the protection of the gods, and was not allowed to be harmed. They agreed to descend the Acropolis after being promised they would be left unharmed, but were slaughtered nonetheless by the followers of miracles, as they considered the men unworthy of the gods' protection.